Right, so we're back with part three, and we're talking about globalism, the third wave of globalism, which is currently where we are right now. Underneath what my little picture in the corner says, these are just basically a bunch of those ubiquitous shipping containers in Bermuda, right? So, with the third wave of globalization, we see that space and time compression is even further dramatically so much so that now we see things made on a global basis. And this is one of the reasons why you're doing your commodity change assignment. It's almost commonplace now for everyday consumer goods and food to have a global production model. In other words, it may be made in one country with raw materials from another country and transported across an ocean to be sold somewhere else. And up until about the 1950s, this was not the case. It was still too expensive. So most of our electronic goods are actually manufactured in several countries, and then those parts are shipped to another country like China, where they are assembled into an actual phone and then sold here. Cars. Back in the 1930s and 40s, they would make a car in the factory in Detroit, and everything was made in the factory right there. Now they may make the car frame in Detroit. The engine may come from a factory in Kentucky. The seats may come from a factory in Mexico. The electronics and radio may come from Thailand, and they're all shipped around the world. And this is made largely in part by the loosening of laws about the movement of money. It used to be very tough to build something in one country and ship it and sell it somewhere else. There were a lot of laws and tax regulations. And so, over the course of the last, say, 60, 70 years, many countries have released or relaxed those laws, which makes it easier. Okay? And so, this leads to the idea of a flat world. Not that the world is flat and that you could fall off the edge, but economically speaking, if you eliminate the barriers to trade and economic transactions, then it doesn't matter if something's made in Mexico, Michigan, or China. And so the world is flat. There are less barriers to it. And the shipping container is, again, that's the physical manifestation. It allows for the quick and easy loading and transferring of any type of good that fits within that box. And you can ship multiple boxes. And so this is why basically today you can go into a store or a grocery store and find products from all over the world and not even have to think twice about it. Another aspect of this is the flow of money. And so we talked a little bit about remittances, or people are sending money from one country to another, and usually on an individual basis done by immigrants or migrants. So I'll use the example of a friend I had who had moved here from Mexico and was working here and saving up his extra money and sending it back to his family in Mexico, right? And what happens is, because it is so easy to do that, you literally put money on an ATM machine, right, here in the United States, and somebody can withdraw it in another country. So it's all computerized, and laws have made that much faster. Also, with travel and laws relaxing that, it's been easier for people to move around the world. Now think about my friend, right? He's sending money back to this little village. It's in a very rural part of Mexico. So that money was being used to build his parents' house. His parents were building a house with that money, which means they had to hire construction workers, right? So that money went and paid the construction workers. Those construction workers had a job. They needed a school for their children, or they needed to go shopping for themselves. And so that's kind of that cumulative causation. That money goes into that local rural economy in Mexico from work obtained here. And so that has a huge impact in his local village, right? Now, it's kind of hard to see here underneath me, but the relationship between countries, it kind of flows back and forth. So right now, there's actually much less immigration to the United States, and so remittances are down. And at times they're up. There's lots of interconnections. But a lot of countries, this is a big part of their budget. So look right here, Nepal. Nepal is a very poor country. It's right between India and China. And a lot of people move to other countries and work. Of all the money that goes into Nepal, all of their basically expenditures over the course of a year, 28% of that comes from people sending money back, remittances. So that's easily almost a third of their economic input is from people outside of the country. In Tajikistan, in Central Asia, it's almost half. So some countries, it's a very big part of that. Another thing we see making it easier to move trade around the world is this idea of the global shift. I asked you a question on your midterm about this, the global shift, and it's the same idea here, that we're seeing this movement in the case of industrial employment. So in other words, if it's just as easy to make something in Brazil or Mexico as it is here, but the people in Brazil or Mexico will work for less money, then that is an incentive for factory owners to shift their factories to these areas, because that's a big cost they can save by paying their workers less money. And so what's happened since the 1970s and 80s is countries like the United States and England and Italy and Germany have seen their manufacturing move to countries like Mexico and Brazil and India and China. Okay? And those economies, like ours, have moved from an industrial economy. We used to be the biggest industrial power in the world to today we are deindustrialized. We are a service economy. It also means that U.S. companies are deterritorialized. So let's use Ford as an example. When you think about American motor cars, Ford is probably the number one. Henry Ford begins building cars in Detroit in the 1900s, and it's still headquartered there, right? Now, because of all these changes, if you look at a Ford F-150 pickup truck, and most people think, the pickup truck, you can't get more American than the big gas-guzzling pickup truck. Only 60% of that truck is made in the United States. The engines are made in Mexico. The seats are also made in Mexico. The radio is made in Taiwan. The brakes are made in, I believe, Vietnam. So parts are made around the world, and it may be assembled here, but only 60% of that truck is made here. Not only that, Ford owns companies like Saab, which is a Swedish car company. Ford is the owner of that. And they sell as many cars in Europe and Asia as they do here. So are they really an American company? You could argue they are because their headquarters are here, but in reality, they're more of a global company. Okay? In fact, you might say they are a transnational corporation. They have operations all over the world. What are the consequences of this? Well, in the countries where we see industries move, like China and Vietnam and Cambodia and India, there are more jobs for women because these factory jobs aren't the stereotypical, working with a hard hat, swinging a hammer. These are, working in factories assembling electronics. And women, as we've talked about often, unfortunately, will work for less money because gendered work tends to be paid inequitably. So you see a huge increase in the number of females who are working outside of the home. The good thing is this is a source of income for females. The bad thing is it's also a form of exploitation. So it kind of goes hand in hand. We also see in countries like the United States where industry leaves, this weakens labor. So remember labor, right? The people who actually make the cars in the factory in Detroit all band together in a union to negotiate their contract, their pay, their vacation time as one. Well, what happens is the car companies have to deal with them because if they don't, the workers go on strike and nothing gets done. But now they can say, if you don't take less money, if you go on strike, we're just going to move the factory to Brazil. And in fact, that's what they do quite often, which weakens labor. When we look at these type of companies, transnational corporations, right, the big companies, we can broadly categorize them in four ways. First one is a multinational. So Coca-Cola is a great example. These countries may have, or these countries, these corporations may have a central office, but Coca-Cola in the United States basically runs a little bit differently than Coca-Cola in Mexico or Israel or South Africa. They share the same ingredient labels, the same secret recipes, the same advertising, the same logo. But for instance, in Mexico, they sweeten the Coca-Cola with real cane sugar. Whereas in the United States, they use corn syrup. It's much cheaper here than Mexico. And so some would argue that Mexican Coke tastes better. And in fact, a lot of restaurants in Chicago will import Mexico Coca-Cola. It's Coca-Cola, but it's made in Mexico. It maybe tastes a little different. But Coca-Cola operates each country's version just a slightly bit different. The next one are the internationals. And these are companies that are firmly based in one country, but have very broad operations around the world. So Toyota is definitely a Japanese car maker. They are headquartered in Japan. Their research and development is done in Japan. But in the 1980s, the United States started taxing cars made in Japan at a higher rate so that people would be encouraged to buy cheaper American cars. One of the things Toyota did was open a factory in Tennessee. So this way, the cars that were made here, maybe they are Toyota cars, and the money that you give to that company goes to Toyota, but the car was made here by American workers. Therefore, it technically wasn't an import. They built it to get around national laws, and many car companies do that. So Volkswagen makes cars in Tennessee, Toyota, Nissan, and American car companies make cars in Europe just for that very same reason. The global transnational, these are similar to the international. They have a centralized hub, but here in each individual international market, they pursue a somewhat different strategy. In other words, Starbucks will do Starbucks one way in this country, but they're a little bit different in China. They favor as much tea as coffee. They're different in England, they're different in France. And what happens is, so Starbucks is a global corporation, and there are Starbucks around the world, and McDonald's is the same way. There's a central hub, a main office, where all decisions come from. But each market is a little bit unique, and you can't really see it here underneath my picture. But what this does is it allows Starbucks to basically modify its restaurant in each country to be more indicative of that country's culture. They call that glocalization, global localization, kind of a mix. And the last one, integrated networks. And these are really complex, very multi-layered companies. So I'll use Nike as an example. If you buy a hoodie with Nike on it, it's a Nike hoodie from maybe you buy it from the Nike store, right? Nike does not own the factory that made that. What happens is this: Nike has their offices in Oregon, so they do have a central office. That's where they do their research and design and marketing. But when they want to sell a shoe or a shirt or a hat or whatever they make, they design it. They say, this is what you need to make the shoe. This much leather, cut it this way, sew here, use these colors for dyes. Then they go around the world and they go to ask factory owners around the world, given these specifications, how much will you charge us to make this t-shirt? So the factory has to go buy all the cotton. They have to pay the people to cut and sew it. And they come back and they say, we will make 3 million t-shirts at 5 cents a piece, or whatever the cost is. And Nike bids out these projects. And if another factory comes in at 3 cents a shirt, then they'll probably go there. It allows them to find the cheapest labor. So the factory is not owned by Nike. When the shirts are made at the factory and they're shipped to the port on a boat, Nike doesn't own the trucks that ship it. They hire that all out. It allows them to follow the lowest costs. So they used to make shirts in China. But as the Chinese economy matured and people started making more money, it cost more. They started moving to Vietnam. So they make a lot of items in Vietnam. And now Vietnam is doing the same thing. Their economy is growing. Workers want more money. And so Nike is increasingly moving its production. They're looking for factories in Bangladesh or Guatemala. One of the things that happens about this, Nike doesn't want to talk about this because a lot of people accuse them, with some degree of honesty, of basically exploiting poor third world laborers because they follow the cheapest costs. They don't own the factory, so they can't insist upon things like fair pay or health insurance or all these other issues. And they argue that's not their job to do that anyway. So they are very guarded about that. If you choose Nike as one of the products that you are going to do for your commodity chain, it'll be very hard for you to find exactly where it was made. They don't really want you to know. So with this global shift, we've seen a lot of redistributions of industry and shuffling of the market. Okay, and interestingly, kind of a side effect is that as manufacturing has become more precise and as manufacturing has become more complex, and as the economy in China grows and workers want more and more money, they can no longer compete as being the low-cost leader. So some manufacturing has actually came back to the U.S., especially in things that are high-tech, like electronics, home goods, things that need a high degree of precision skill-making tools. You need a highly educated workforce to do that. And so that is one thing where we still excel. In other words, if innovation and productivity, and they're using advanced technology as part of the manufacturing process as opposed to sewing clothes, what we see manufacturing is actually returning to countries like the United States and in Europe. We also see this shift with the big box retailers. So in the United States, the vast majority of economic activity is consumer purchasing. We go to IKEA or Kohl's or Target or Walmart or Walgreens to buy things. These retailers sell huge amounts of product. And they are basically the driving force in this consumer service economy. And they dictate to manufacturers how things are built. And that's because, one, if you are going to sell something and you make a t-shirt, if you sell it on the internet, you're going to sell only so many. But if Walmart picks up a contract to sell your t-shirt across the country in 4,000 stores, you're going to sell a lot more. And you're going to sell a lot more quickly. So they have a bigger customer base. Okay? But what they require in exchange is flexible production. So if you're going to make t-shirts, right? Think about fashion, clothing. Every fall it changes, right? What was cool this year is not going to be cool next year. So maybe right now the big thing is I survived the coronavirus outbreak of 2019 t-shirts. And they make a lot of them and they're selling like crazy right now. But you know that next year no one's going to want that t-shirt. So you have to be flexible enough to turn to something else. So with these new manufacturing, you have to be able to stop what you're doing and turn on a dime. Another thing is this. When Walmart looks to carry shirts, or IKEA wants to carry furniture, or Staples wants to carry markers or pens, or Walgreens wants to carry whatever, right? They're going to do the same thing that Nike does. They're going to buy those shirts from a manufacturer, but they want to find the lowest price. So all these producers that make things have to be able to compete, because if you can make your t-shirt half a cent cheaper than your competitor, but you're selling because of their customer base over 1 million t-shirts, that's a lot of money. So they are producers that make things now in this country are very, very strict cost limits. All of this leads to very complex production chains. I'm going to show you an example about the flip-flop in a moment. And what this does, if you think back to the very first video that you watched, this idea of competitive advantage, that each part of the world has something maybe they do better than any place else. And so if that is the case, they can focus on that. And if you are part of a global economy and you can truly sell your product anywhere in the world, and you make the best bananas in the world, then this only makes competitive advantage even greater. It also links up regional manufacturing clusters. So if your area of the country makes tires, but there's no car manufacturers, you can still focus on that because that's your competitive advantage. But now you can ship those tires to an area that makes cars, like Detroit. Or if you make electronic goods on a large scale, like in China, you can ship that to a manufacturing cluster that makes the camera lenses, like Thailand, and sell it around the world. Clothes are a great example of this. Clothes are made around the world. They're made usually because it's much cheaper to make clothes in Bangladesh or China because you don't have to pay as much. And clothing is still very labor intensive. Someone has to cut the fabric and sew it by hand still. And then this last part, this idea of the just-in-time production. And all of you have seen an example of this. How many times have we gone lately to the stores and found that either they're out of toilet paper or hand sanitizer or soap or something that they're out of completely? And why can't they just make more? Why didn't they have more? Let's use toilet paper as an example. Toilet paper is made at basically the same rate. You really can't make toilet paper faster than it gets made. They make it at a regular basis. Now, toilet paper sells at a pretty steady pace during a normal time. People buy what they need to have in the house, right? You know that if you run out of toilet paper, it's only a walk down the street to Walgreens to buy some more. So you have enough to get through the day, maybe hopefully 3 or 4 rolls. But there's no need to stockpile it because if you need more, there's always going to be more in the store, right? So on that assumption, stores only carry enough toilet paper in the store and in back to get through to their next delivery. So if Target gets a semi-truck every Monday for toilet paper, they only order enough toilet paper to last that week. because they know next week they're going to have another truck. And they also know that people are buying toilet paper at a steady pace. And so you can pretty much figure out, I usually sell 15 cases of toilet paper a week. I'll order 18 just in case, and that's fine. And that's how most production is done. Because if you were to buy extra toilet paper, if they only sell 15 cases a week, but they bought 300, that extra 260 cases in the back, they paid for that. That's money they didn't have to spend right away. So it's more expensive. And a phrase I used to use in the restaurant industry is when you talk about ordering stuff and having too much stuff on hand, more than you need in just that week, money on the shelf could be money in the bank. Now, here's the problem that we have now. What happens if something makes the demand for toilet paper increase exponentially? Target sold 15 cases a week, but now they could have sold 15,000 because people are inherently irrational and are afraid and are buying toilet paper left and right. And so they sell 15 cases in one day. Well, now they're out for the week. Just-in-time production doesn't allow for that big backpile. And the companies that make it don't make more because they make just enough to sell what they need to. So it takes a while to start making more toilet paper. And again, using industries, textile industries, they make the shirts quick enough to sell right away. They have to be able to change the shirt design to meet the changing needs. So they make the clothes just in time. And let's end this with the idea of an example of a global production chain, the flip-flop, your handy little plastic rubber sandal that you buy. So it's made out of plastic, right? Kind of a flexible plastic / rubber. And that is made, the raw material is oil. So oil here is drilled. It's here in Kuwait. It's from an oil mine. It gets put onto a big, huge tanker, and it sails through the Indian Ocean all the way here to Daesan, South Korea. So a couple thousand miles, maybe 2 months by a boat. And here it's uploaded to a factory that takes the oil and turns it into these tiny little plastic, like beads, like little pellets. And they have a dye in them. And that pellet is then shipped by a boat here to Fengzhou, China, where it's taken to a factory and the pellets, sorry about that, are melted and put into a mold and you make a flip-flop. So now you have these flip-flops and don't need to sell them here. Gets back on a cargo ship in those containers. It's shipped all the way back here and ends up in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in a market or a store and is sold here. So this is where the flip-flop ends up. It started here, but that whole chain back and forth, global production chain. And one thing we haven't covered, you want to go further, what happens when you're done with that flip-flop? Maybe it goes into the trash, maybe it breaks and you throw it in the garbage, and then it's shipped over here to a landfill in Somalia, or disposal. Or maybe it's recycled and sent to a factory in India where it's remelted down back into plastic and molded into something else. So the production chain, very complex. Now, I'm going to come back to this second video in just a little bit. This will be part 4, so just thank you and hold on.